James awoke to an all-encompassing darkness. At first, it seemed like it was just the lingering fog of sleep, the kind that clings to the edges of dreams before giving way to reality. But as his senses sharpened and he regained his clarity, he realized that this darkness was different somehow. It pressed against his eyelids with a weight that made it difficult to breathe. It felt claustrophobic. Panic began to stir in the corners of his mind. His head throbbed with a dull, persistent ache that seemed to pulse throughout the rest of his body. He tried to move, to reach out, but his limbs were pinned. He realized that he was trapped in a space that felt unnervingly small. The air was stale, and every breath he took was laboured, coming in shallow gasps. He couldn't fully expand his chest due to his arms being compressed so close to his body. One urgent question came to the forefront of his mind. Where was he? The question tumbled through his thoughts, frantic and desperate, but no answer came. His memories were a jumbled and distorted mess, composed of fragmented scenes that refused to come together into anything coherent. He couldn't remember exactly how he got here, or even where here was. He forced himself to breathe, in a vain attempt to calm the rising tide of panic he could feel within him. He just needed to figure out where he was, to understand what was happening to him. With some effort, he tried to lift his arms again, but they barely moved an inch before meeting solid resistance. It was cold and unyielding, pressing in from all sides. A horrible realization began to take shape in his thoughts. James was trapped. No, not just trapped. He was buried. A coffin. The word slithered into his mind like a snake, bringing with it a wave of abject terror so intense that it nearly choked him. As reality dawned on him, he began to thrash against the confines of his prison, kicking and shoving with all the strength he could muster, but it was no use. The walls of the coffin held firm, sealing him in its suffocating embrace. It was entirely involuntary, but he screamed. It erupted from his throat, raw and primal, but it barely echoed in the tight, constricted space. It was a pitiful sound, but his body was in survival mode. After his lizard brain subsided, his logical side kicked into full gear. How could this be happening? How did he find himself in this position? His mind raced, searching in vain for some semblance of answers. Perhaps there had been some kind of accident, or he was thought to be dead. Maybe it was all a terrible mistake, and they would soon dig him up. But deep down, James knew that this wasn't true. This wasn't a mistake. This was something far worse. After a few moments of silent contemplation, time became meaningless as he lay there, helpless. Mere seconds stretched into minutes, into hours, into an eternity. The walls of the coffin seemed to feel like they were closing in on him, and he knew he had to do something, anything, to get out. He pushed up on the lid, straining against the wood with every ounce of strength he had. After only a few seconds, his muscles screamed in protest, but he continued to push for as long as he could. The lid didn't budge an inch. He had no idea where he was, but he presumed that he was beneath 6 feet of dirt. Despite logic suggesting otherwise, he pounded his fists upwards, his desperation growing in intensity with each futile attempt. He was rapidly running out of time. He could feel it in the way that his breaths grew shorter, more laboured, as if the very air around him was being sucked away. But the more that he thought about the reducing oxygen, his breathing became more rapid, ironically making his situation much worse. Then, in the midst of his frantic struggles, he heard something. It was faint at first, just a whisper on the edge of his awareness due to the sound of his own heart beating in his ears. But it was enough to make him freeze. He tried to hold his breath and strained to listen. Every nerve in his body was on high alert. A voice. Someone was out there. Someone could hear him. His survival instincts took over again, and he didn't have a second to think before he found himself screaming again. "Help!" he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation and exhaustion. "Please, help me!" There was a pause, a long moment of agonizing silence, and then the voice came again. It was weak, barely more than a whisper, but it was there nonetheless. "Hello?" The voice was hoarse, trembling with fear. James's stomach dropped. He had a terrible suspicion that this person may not be able to help him. They sounded as terrified as he was. "Please, you have to help me," he cried, his voice rising in pitch. "I'm trapped. I can't get out." Another pause, and then the voice spoke again, shakier this time. I think I am too." The words hit James like a punch to the gut. He was in the same terrible predicament as him. A cold sweat broke out across his skin as the full horror of the situation began to sink in. They were both trapped. And if the other person was as helpless as he was, then how could either of them escape? Was there any way out? But there was no time for despair. They had to try. They had to fight. "Can you move?" James asked, struggling to contain the fear in his voice. I don't think so," the other person replied, their voice barely audible. It didn't make sense. None of this made any sense. But James couldn't dwell on that now. He had to focus on trying to escape, somehow. "We have to find a way to break free," he said, trying in vain to keep the panic from his voice. "Maybe if we push together." But before he could finish, a new sound cut through the darkness. It was a low, wet sound, like something being torn apart. Almost visceral. The sound of flesh ripping, of bones crunching under pressure. It was close. Too close. What is that?" the other voice whispered, their dread palpable. James didn't know. He didn't want to know. But whatever it was getting closer. His heart pounded in his chest as the terrifying sound grew louder, more intense. He began to hear it all around him now. A chorus of carnage. The sound surrounded him, attacking him from all sides. He could hear it very loudly now, scraping against the wood of the coffin. The sound of claws or teeth, or something far worse, gnawing at the barrier that separated them from whatever horrors lurked outside. "No, no, no," James whispered, his voice now trembling in terror. "This can't be happening." The other voice was silent now, too, as if they were also listening to the sounds of their imminent doom approaching. It almost felt like the calm before the storm. And then, without warning, James heard a pained scream pierce his ears. It was a blood-curdling scream, raw and filled with a terror that shook him to his core. He could hear the other poor soul thrashing against the confines of their prison, their cries of pain and fear increasing in volume exponentially. "What's happening? What's happening?" James shouted, adrenaline coursing through his body in a vain attempt to save himself. But there was no answer. The only sounds that came from the other person now were choked, gurgling gasps, as if something was tearing them apart from the inside. And then he heard it. The unmistakable sound of flesh being ripped from bone, of teeth sinking into muscle. He couldn't quite believe what he was hearing, but he came to the conclusion that he was hearing the man being eaten alive. James couldn't help it. A terrified scream erupted from his mouth, his mind reeling with horror. He flailed against his confines, his nails clawing at the surface until they bled. But there was no escape, he realised. He was trapped, helpless, and whatever was out there was coming for him next. He knew it. The sounds of the other person's grisly death grew fainter, fading into a sickening and traumatic silence. But the fear that James felt coursing through his body didn't fade with it. It only grew stronger, more suffocating, as he realised the terrible truth. These weren't coffins. They were something else, something far worse. He'd assumed that the walls were wooden. His mind was so focused on escaping that the cold surface felt natural to him, nothing out of the ordinary. But he could feel it now, the subtle shift beneath him, as if the very walls were alive. He focused his attention on feeling the lid, if you can call it that now, mere inches from his face. It felt softer now, almost like flesh. He could almost feel it, pulsing gently. As he did this, however, he felt it move, closing in around him. James screamed again as the realisation took hold, but it was too late. The coffin, no, the creature, had him in its grip, and there was no escape. He could feel it tightening around him, squeezing the breath from his lungs. His skin began to burn, a searing pain that spread across his body as the walls surrounding him slowly constricted, crushing him with a force that felt impossibly strong. In one final attempt at self-preservation, he tried to fight, to push back against the creature, but it was no use. It was too powerful, too relentless. He could feel it feeding on him now, draining the life from his body, consuming him piece by piece. The pain was unbearable now, an all-consuming agony that left him gasping for air, his vision swimming. He could feel his bones snapping under the pressure, his flesh being torn asunder as the creature fed on him. And then, just as he thought he couldn't bear it any longer, a new sensation washed over him. A cold, numbing sensation that began to creep through his body, dulling the pain. He was dying. He could feel it. His body was shutting down, finally succumbing to the darkness that had enveloped him since the moment he awoke. But as the last vestiges of consciousness began to slip away from him, one final thought pierced the encroaching fog. A thought that filled him with a new kind of terror, deeper and more profound than anything he'd felt before. This creature, the thing that had trapped him, was not just feeding on his body, it was feeding on his soul. And once it consumed every last piece of him, there would be nothing left. No memories, no thoughts, no trace that he had ever existed. As the darkness closed in, James realised that this was not just death. This was oblivion. And in his final moments, as the last flicker of his consciousness was snuffed out, he understood the true horror of his fate. James had not been buried alive. He had been devoured by the darkness itself.